You're listening to the New Heroes of Old novelcast, written and read by author Greg Bulmash. Season 1, Hell on $5 a Day. Episode 13. Chapter 13. Curiouser and Curiouser. Kurt headed up the bank, crossing the grass and coming to the edge of what seemed to be a town. The grass cut off at a crisp line and a packed dirt road stretched forward from it. Wooden sidewalks bordering the road on both sides as it ran off into the distance. Kurt hadn't looked at the grass much on the other side of the bank, but as he was about to leave it, he noticed that it was all a uniform length, like a golf course or a park. He wouldn't have been surprised if this was some genetic or magical property of the grass, yet he couldn't help thinking that there might be a lesser-known mythical figure like Karen, but who spent eternity on a riding mower. The buildings on the main street were short, all single-story, and behind them ramshackle houses stretched back as far as Kurt could see. Shoddily constructed wood plank buildings with flat roofs and almost no space between them. The main street seemed nice enough. The buildings along it were crafted with more care, the wood cleanly carpentered and cut in uniform slats, the corners of the building sharp, and people walked along the street, just like any other town, oblivious to his presence at their border. Kurt walked over to the edge of one of the sidewalks and stepped onto it. The only time anyone seemed to walk in the street was to cross it, and he didn't want to attract undue attention. The people ahead of him looked alive for all intents and purposes. A pallor-tinged red from the ever-present flames gave them a pinkish color, almost as if they were blushing. Their clothing ranged from togas to high-necked Victorian garb to even an Armani suit, but all of it was drab, all of it lacking the vibrancy of colors in the living world. It was whatever they were buried in, he guessed. The clothes of the dead. He was wearing a pale golden-orange shirt that his mother bought him because she said it would go great with a light-colored blue jean. Compared to the dull colors, it stood out like a flashing light. Even though it had to be over 80 degrees, he untied his jacket from around his waist and put it on, zipping it up to the neck to hide his shirt. He kept his head down as he walked, glancing sideways into the windows of the buildings he passed. There was no glass in the windows, but probably didn't matter in a place where there were no bugs and the weather probably didn't vary much. There was a library, a barber shop, a yoga studio, a storefront revival church, and a room where a group of people were playing Simon Says. The other storefronts contained a couple of tables and chairs each. One had card games going on while people played board games in another, and a few rooms were unused. 10 buildings up, the sidewalk cut off as he passed through an intersection only 8 feet wide, giving him a chance to look down the narrow street into the mass of shacks. The term shantytown coming to mind. While the construction of the various shacks seemed haphazard, he could see streets crossing the one he looked down. Best he could tell, the disorderly squats were built on an orderly grid. Curiouser and curiouser, he mumbled to himself. Stepping up onto the other side of the intersection, he heard a voice shouting. It was female, young, and as he strained to hear what she was saying, he realized it was one word being repeated over and over again. Alive! Looking up from his feet, he saw the girl, perhaps 15, another block down, pointing at him. Alive! Alive! She shouted. Other people on the street began to notice, each pausing in their strolls or shopping to look where she was pointing. And as they noticed him, they began to approach. Kurt twirled around. Behind him, people came out of the buildings. A group was forming and closing in around him. He backed off the walkway and down the side street as the people began to fill up the bottleneck between the buildings. They didn't seem particularly angry or excited, more curious than anything. Still, he was getting a serious zombie movie vibe he could not ignore. As the crowd grew bigger and closer, the urge to flee became more intense. It didn't take long for the urge to become an imperative. Kurt turned and ran, the shouts of "Alive! Alive!" following behind him. People came out of the doors of the shacks in front of him, clogging his path. Spotting another narrow intersection up ahead, Kurt slowed and whipped to his left around the corner, speeding up again as he got onto the straight road. More people had joined in the cry. "Alive! Alive!" voices called. Kurt sped around the next corner, turning right this time. His heart pounded in his chest and the sweat ran from his brow, but the sounds of the following mob were dwindling behind him. He turned at random, trying to make his trail hard to follow. Though his lungs burned from the running, he forced himself to pound onward, eventually slowing to a jog, and then a brisk walk when his feet hurt and his breath became difficult to catch. Moving randomly through the warren of shacks, he put more distance between himself and the mob, and when he couldn't hear even a faint whisper of their voices, he finally allowed himself to stop. There was no sidewalk on these dirt streets, but the house to his left had a couple of feet of paving stones running along the front. Kurt sat down on the stones, slipping off his backpack before leaning his back against the wall of the shack with a thud, panting. He set the backpack down and unzipped his jacket, tearing it off, then unbuttoned his shirt almost to the waist. He gripped the lapels of his shirt and flapped it, forcing the air to circulate around his sweat-drenched torso. He wanted to throw up. He could feel the bile rising in his throat, but he held it down. Slowly, he opened the backpack and pulled out his bottle of water, doing his best not to guzzle from it for fear that too much, too fast would all just come back up. After a while, he settled down, his breathing slowing to nearly normal. He'd drunk about half the water. He closed the bottle and put it back in his pack. He had an urge to get out another cigarette, but after that run, he decided against it. Kurt jumped to his feet as he heard the door open behind him, the backpack held by its strap, ready to be swung. The man who stood in the doorway was older, round his 50s or so, with a short beard and long curly hair, a tunic covering his body. Kurt stared at him, contemplating whether or not to run. The man stared back. "You're alive," the man said, looking from Kurt's eyes to his sneakers and then back again. His posture loosened, and he chuckled as if relieved. "You're alive!" "Yeah?" Kurt said warily, still ready to run at the first signs of trouble, his hand tightening on the strap of his backpack. The man looked down the street in both directions and then waved Kurt toward him. "Come in. We must get you out of the street before anyone else sees you." Kurt stepped forward tentatively, trying to explore the man's eyes. He didn't know what he'd find, though. In living people, the eyes were the window to the soul. By all reasoning, this man was a soul, so what his eyes became a window to, Kurt could only imagine. He seemed genuine enough. Kurt walked in quickly, letting the man shut the door behind them. The house was small. The main room in which Kurt stood was perhaps 10 by 10 feet, curtains covering a doorway on the side. In the center sat a rough table of boards and posts with some similarly constructed chairs. "My name is Corenices," the man said behind him. Kurt turned, shouldering his pack. "Kurt Gray," he said, extending a hand. He'd done it out of reflex, but before he could withdraw it, Corenices had taken it in a firm grip. He was solid. Kurt didn't know what he expected. He'd never given that much thought to the manifestation of souls in hell, but all the literature had portrayed them as specters, insubstantial wraiths. Corenices, though, had substance, even mass, but it was lifeless mass. The hand, though solid, didn't seem to have bones, at least none Kurt could feel. It was more like rubber, somewhat hardened, or a stiff clay. The best possible comparison would be shaking the hand of a mannequin and having it shake back. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Kurt Gray," Corenices said, pronouncing Kurt's name all as one word. I have been here so long that life was becoming like an old dream. I was not sure I had ever dreamed. It is wonderful to be reminded that it really happened. Coronisus was smiling broadly, his face lighting up so much that it was hard to reconcile the smile with the man's state and where he was. Laetia, Coronisus called. Come out and eat our guest, Gurkre, from the world. From behind the curtain, a woman came out. She was short, slightly under 5 feet. But Coronisus was no giant either. Maybe it was just them, maybe the time they lived. Kurt recalled having read somewhere that the human race, due to better nutrition overall, was getting taller as the years passed. Coronisus turned, smiling proudly, to beckon Laetia over to meet Kurt. She came to stand next to Coronisus, and he put an arm around her, beaming proudly at Kurt. This is my wife, Laetia, Coronisus said. We were married 25 summers during life, but I passed before she did. When she passed, she spent hundreds of waking periods seeking me out in dismays. A better wife and greater love no man could seek in life or death. Kurt's hand twitched forward before falling to rest at his side. He bowed rather than feel her hand in his. It wasn't that it disgusted him in a nauseating sense, it just gave him what could best be called the heebie-jeebies. Thank you for having me in your home. Coronisus waved Kurt to a chair and bid him to sit. Once Kurt did, Coronisus sat too, Laetia standing behind Coronisus's chair. Are you comfortable? Oh, yes, thank you, Kurt said. If it wouldn't be too much of an imposition, though, would you have any water? Coronisus frowned deeply, and Kurt feared he'd been too presumptuous. I'm sorry, Kurt apologized. I didn't mean to. Coronisus looked down and raised a hand. No. There is no need to apologize. Coronisus raised his head, and there was a genuine expression of sadness on it. It is my shame to not be able to offer you, my guest, the full hospitality of my home. But I would be a worse host if I did. The food of this world is not for persons still of yours. Kurt's eyes widened. Is it poison? He asked, thinking of what might have happened if he'd had a drink from the Acheron, remembering suddenly that the rivers in the underworld were even dangerous to the touch. If it was only that, Coronisus said, a man may enter Hades' realm, but if he eats its food or drinks its water, he may never leave. Kurt shuddered at this revelation. All the edible food and drinkable water he knew of in this whole damned place were in his backpack. And that was lunch, not provisions for what might be a long stay. Holy shit, Kurt said. Pardon my French. He should have remembered the tale of Persephone from mythology class. You've been a great host. You saved me from making what could have been a terrible mistake. Coronisus smiled and Laetia behind him beamed, apparently proud of the compliment Kurt had paid to her husband. Perhaps we can trade stories, Coronisus suggested. It would be a way of showing friendship, and I must admit, I am very curious about how you came to be here. That'd be great, but something had been nagging at Kurt, and he felt like he would burst if he didn't ask about it. How are you speaking English? I'm not. We all just seem to speak the same language here. Some think it has to do with the Tower of Babel. In that story from the Jewish holy books, once men all spoke the same language, but the Lord of creation scattered them and changed their languages because they became proud and tried to build a tower to reach heaven. It is thought, perhaps, all those languages were a function of the flesh. And once we became spirit, we returned to the one original language. Kurt considered the explanation. Okay, but I'm flesh. How come we understand each other? Perhaps the Tower of Babel concept is wrong. Perhaps it is an enchantment. Or perhaps there is some part of you that always spoke the one language and has awoken upon hearing it. I cannot say. Would you like to trade stories now?" Kurt nodded. Coronisus began the exchange, claiming it would be rude to let himself satisfy his curiosity first. He was a sandal maker from a village about 3 days' walk from Athens. How long ago he'd lived, he couldn't remember. Coronisus had lived an uneventful life, and he believed that was the reason why he'd come to this place. He had not been hero enough to go to the Elysian fields and rest in glory, nor had he been wicked enough to be punished. Instead, he lived out a meager existence much like he had in the world. Laiatea sat and listened, sometimes nodding. She never spoke. Kurt, in turn, related an abridged tale of how he'd arrived, leaving out the details of how he'd first struck out with Jennifer at the club and how he'd been a bit zonked when Robe Guy knocked him through the portal. They talked longer, Kurt telling Coronisus about the world, about technological advances and world politics, though it turned out Coronisus had heard much of it from new arrivals. When Kurt started yawning, though, he tried to control it, but it was hard to hide. "You are tired," Coronisus said. "We have a bed in the other room." Coronisus stood and Kurt followed him through the other curtain, grabbing his backpack off the corner of the chair where he'd hung it. The bedroom was smaller than the main room, containing little more than the bed, a small table, and a window that looked onto the wall of another shack less than a foot away. "It is not much," Coronisus said, waving his hand at the bed, "but it is all I can offer." Kurt extended his hand and Coronisus shook it. "I really appreciate your generosity," Kurt said, smiling. The odd feel of Coronisus's hand in his not quite the disturbing shock it had been before. Coronisus smiled in return. "Thank you. May you sleep peacefully and wake restored." "Thank you," Kurt said. He watched as Coronisus left the room and let the curtain fall closed behind him. The bed was small and the mattress thin, but it didn't matter. He set his backpack on the floor, took off his boots, lay down, and was asleep within seconds. Kurt hadn't checked his watch before he fell asleep, but he was sure he'd slept at least 10 hours. Waking slowly, he stretched his arms and legs, glad for having had the opportunity to rest. He'd been so fatigued the night before. "Good morning," a voice said. Kurt recognized the voice only vaguely. It was as if it had been in a dream of his, one which didn't bring back pleasant sensations. He dreamed of going to hell, he remembered, dreamed of being chased and ancient Greeks living in a shack. "Good morning," he replied in kind, turning on his side as he opened his eyes to look at the owner of the voice. Seated in a chair not 3 feet from his bed was Robe Guy. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice patronizing, saccharine sweet. He'd lost the robe and now looked like somebody out of a Levi's Dockers commercial. A pair of slightly wrinkled khakis and dark blue cotton shirt covering his muscular frame. "Shit," was all Kirk could say. "Glad to see you too," Robe Guy said, standing. "You weren't easy to find. I had to sniff around this slum for hours." Kurt sat up, slowly, so as not to make any wrong moves, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Sorry to put you to so much trouble," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Next time I'll leave a trail of breadcrumbs." As soon as he said it, he knew it was snide, but the fear was gone. What could the guy do to Kurt that was worse than the situation he was in now? You're a prince," the Robe Guy said. "Clean yourself up, put on your shoes, you got 10 minutes. There's a piss pot in the corner if you need it." He turned to leave, and in the back of his shirt, Kurt could see a hole with a blood stain in it, around where the knife had gone in and come out. Kurt waited until the guy was out of the room to use the bucket. Shaking off and zipping up, he scanned the room, trying to find an escape route. The window was very close to the next shack. Kurt would be lucky to be able to squeeze between them sideways. He sat down on the bed and quickly put on his boots. Then he opened his pack and pulled out the sandwich and the bottle of water. Not being sure how long he'd be in hell, he needed to conserve his food. He ate half the sandwich, enough to kill the growling in his stomach, and he drank just enough water to wash it down without being too greedy. It left about a cup and a half in the bottle, which wouldn't last him very long. The human body needed 3 or 4 times that much liquid every day. He'd die of dehydration before he'd die of hunger. And then what? Would his soul go wherever it was supposed to go, or would it be trapped in hell? Was hell the place it was supposed to go? Would he chicken out as death approached and drink the local water? He put his stuff back in his pack and threw it over his shoulder. He'd have to go along for now, but escape would be on his mind, both from his current situation and from hell itself. Kurt had meant to ask Coronisus if he knew a way out, but in the course of their chat he'd forgotten, and now it didn't look like there'd be a chance. He was going to have to hope his captor knew the way out and was headed in that direction. Robe Guy sat at the table as Kurt came through the curtain. Coronisus and Lyatia cowering by the door. "Ready to go?" he asked, standing. Kurt nodded, then turned to Coronisus. "Sorry." He wasn't sure, but he thought Coronisus nodded to him, giving him absolution. At least he hoped that Coronisus could forgive him for leading this intruder to his home. Robe Guy walked to the door and opened it, waving Kurt out. "Come on," he said, grabbing Kurt's arm and pulling him away. Kurt looked back at Coronisus and Lyatia's doorway and saw them peek out. Lyatia waved farewell. Then Robe Guy dragged Kurt around a corner, and they were gone. Robe Guy released Kurt a few minutes later when it became apparent that Kurt would follow without protest. They walked along the closest main street, following it toward the center of the cavern. If one of the souls noticed that Kurt was alive, they didn't make a big deal of it this time, crossing the street to avoid the vampire, who would snarl at anyone even remotely in their way. Other than the snarling, they walked in silence for hours, keeping a moderate pace. Kurt looked around, trying to find an escape route, but each block was like the next, each intersection leading to a warren of shacks. The light never changed, the flames in the center of the cavern's roof a constant and unwavering source. And eventually, in the distance, an end to the main street appeared. It wasn't another meadow. It was a straight drop-off, a cliff leading out into space. Kurt's feet hurt, as did his shins. His boots were advertised as being for walking, but still the miles they covered were more than his unconditioned city-living body was prepared for. He was sure his feet were blistered, and he wanted to sit down and rest a moment, but Robe Guy seemed unwavering in his purpose. "You ever been here before?" Kurt asked, breaking the long silence, the cliff looming a few hundred yards away. "Once," Robe Guy said, "years ago, during the war. But I didn't get to see the sights." "So how do you know where you're going?" "All roads lead to Pandemonium. We just follow them toward the center and we'll reach it." "What's Pandemonium?" "Shut up." Kurt did as he was told, walking silently until they reached the end of the road. The last building, the sidewalk, the street, all ended mere inches from the edge. A thin sliver of dirt and rock separated them from the open air. At the edge, Kurt could see down into the center. It was somewhat like Dante had described, concentric circles leading down, though Kurt could only really see the next. The rest blocked from his sight by patches of clouds and the pure distance. The next one down seemed to be at least a mile below, the tops of what appeared to be skyscrapers looking like pinpoints on a map, and he couldn't locate a stairway or elevator or ladder leading down. "What's your name, kid?" Robe Guy asked. "Kurt. What's yours?" "Vinny." Kurt." "Yeah? Have a nice trip." Vinny shoved Kurt over the edge of the cliff. "Wait, don't go yet. Please hit like and subscribe to encourage my behavior. Knowing people are reading or listening is what keeps me going. If you can't wait for the other episodes, check out the audiobook at bounce.ws/books. That's bounce.ws/BOOKS. And please visit bulmash.com for the latest updates on the novels, podcasts, and the journey from here to Season 12. The New Heroes of Old Novelcast is read and produced by Greg Bulmash and distributed by Bulmash Media, LLC. Copyright 2026 by Greg Bulmash. Music is from the YouTube audio library. The opening music is Jungle by Akash Gandhi. The closing music is Better by Anno Domini Beats. Thanks for listening, and remember to come back soon.